Alright, so I'm gonna show you how to use my character layer trim shader for Unreal Engine 4. So once you've downloaded the shader files, you should have a folder like this named UE4 with a bunch of stuff in it. So you just take that whole folder, copy it over to your project's content folder, which usually would be Drive, Unreal Projects, your project name, content, and you just paste it in there. So next you need to launch your project, because actually there are some modifications that you need to do to the shader for it to work properly, because sadly it doesn't just work straight out of the box. So once you open your project, you will have the folder named UE4, and in there you have a materials folder and the master character shader. So once you open that up, you will see there's a couple of warnings, and also a bunch of nodes are not connected. That is because I'm using a material function for the shader, and when you copy the shader, the material function references usually are broken, so you need to restore those. So included in the folder there should be a material function called mf_forloops, and this is the material function that I'm using in this shader. This is the only material function. So basically all you need to do is click on these, select these unspecified functions, and just link this material function. Okay, so I've laid out the nodes in a way so that you can easily reconnect them. So just make sure to connect them in the order from top to bottom that they're laid out. As you can see, some nodes are automatically connected, or should be automatically connected. So this is a little bit tedious, but you only have to do it once. After that, you're all set to go. So just to make sure that you connect the nodes correctly, I'm not going to skip this process. I'm going to show you the whole process. As you can see on the last two material functions, the bottom two inputs will not be connected. Alright, so now we managed to get rid of one error message. The other error message is for the missing textures. So you will have to go in and reconnect your textures. Now, if you have only downloaded the shader, you might be missing some of these textures, so you will have to create them yourself, or plug in placeholder textures for the time being. So while I'm plugging in these textures, I'm gonna quickly explain where to plug which texture. Right. So this is the base, the background layer of this material. This is the unique texture for your character. So as the name suggests, the base color is the base color. ORM is ambient occlusion, roughness, and metalness. The metalness should be a complete black and white layer, like as minimal gray values as possible. And then there's the normal map. We need to plug in another one, which is the cloth paint texture. So this is basically just 3 masks that define where each of the different layers will be blended in. And then we need to plug in the textures for the layers. So these can be placeholders as well, because for each material instance you will replace them most likely. So I'm just going to plug in like a default cloth in both of them. Now you also need to plug in a metal texture. As you can see, the name is roughness rust metal. So that's literally what it does. Roughness is just the roughness of the material. Rust can be used to blend between the two different colors that you define for the material, and then metal is just the metalness, in case you want to use any non-black and white or grayscale metalness values. Okay, and the last layer is the trim. Hopefully the names for these inputs should be fairly self-explanatory. Alright, and another layer, actually the last layer, is the paint layer. Okay, so now we're all set. All the warnings have disappeared, and you can get ready to use your shader. So this is all nice and well, but of course you're not going to change the shader whenever you use you are trying to use this shader for like an actual character. You will create a material instance. So let's just quickly do that, and I'll give you a brief overview of how that works. Basically, once you create a material instance, you have a lot of parameters exposed to you, and I've tried to organize them as much as possible into different groups. So as you can see, each layer, so to speak, has their own unique group in here. So if you want to swap out the base texture of your character, you just need to open up the background group, and here are all your textures, and you can easily exchange them. Now these two overlay colors that I have that are available to be modified here affect, well, as the name suggests, they are being overlaid over the base color, and there are two different ones for each of the two cloth layers. They will be overlaid over where the cloth is masked. So if we open up the cloth layer, you can define which of these are. So this mask texture has 3 channels available, and you can define which of these channels will be used to mask this type of cloth. But usually I would suggest to just leave it at the default. If you are more familiar with the shader, then you can change this. So in here you have your textures, you have metalness values you can change, and normal map intensity and tiling, of course. So this is quite abstract right now. So what I'll do is I will load in the character to demonstrate how this is all going to look. So we got a bunch of materials. And if I just take this material instance and use my master material as the parent, we can start applying it. Interesting. Alright. So I'm going to use this scatter mesh as a preview mesh so we can see the changes on the character itself. So in this case, I plugged in the cape texture, so I will apply the shader to the cape. Alright, and there we go. So, to modify the cape, the biggest impact will probably be from the cloth, because most of it is made up out of cloth. So the way that the cloth works is that it's using this CCR texture, which basically means those are two black and white mask channels for the two different colors that you can apply and the roughness. So if I change the first color, you can see it basically tints the whole cloth, and the second one will also tint it, but if you look and if you pay close attention, you can see that the impact is a bit greater on this kind of cloudy pattern. So where the first channel tints the overall color, the second one will affect the cloud pattern a lot stronger. And these channels get added on top of each other, so it's like an additive system. So for these two layers, you can also adjust the matterness, so you can really use these two masks to define any kind of material. You can adjust the tiling like this and the normal map intensity. Alright, so the cloth 2 basically works exactly the same way, only on a different mask. For this cape, I mainly used the cloth 1, so there won't be like any modification if I change this. For the metalness is basically defined by your base color's metalness. I'm just using it as a layer mask, and using that means that you can also customize it quite freely. Like, you can change the color or the roughness intensity. So in this case, this is a multiply of the roughness that is being plugged in here. And yeah, you can change the color of the rust. This is not this material is quite shiny, so there's not much going to happen if I change the rust color. Okay, so for the next channel we have the paint, which is this big paint pattern on the back. It's basically using an RGB mask, and for each channel, red, green and blue, you have a color that you can define. So this channel, I can make it yellow, any color that I want. This material is fully rough because it's only supposed to be used for, well, paint, which is like very rough. But if you don't like this aspect of the shader, of course you can change it in whatever way you want. It should not be very difficult if you have a basic understanding of materials in Unreal Engine 4. There's one slider that works a little bit different, which is the paint power. Basically it just applies the power node to the paint blending, and as a result you can see that the transition between the paint and the underlying layers becomes a lot harsher if you increase this, or softer if you decrease it. And the last slider for this is the use paint. I've turned this into a float value, even though it's not really necessary, because if you use a static switch parameter, the shader will need to be recompiled whenever you change this. But if you want to be able to dynamically change the intensity of the paint, it needs to be a float value. Again, if you don't like this aspect of the shader, feel free to change it. Okay, so this brings us to the last layer, which is the trim. So the trim is kind of special in the layout. As you can see, it is horizontally tiling, and that allows for some special modifications. So once again, it's using two colors, and the last one is a mask for the trim itself. So the first two colors work like with the other materials. Basically they just have a mask. For each mask you can individually adjust the glossiness or roughness. And the matterness. Again, you have a normal map intensity that you can adjust, and you have the horizontal tiling value. There's another slider to turn off the trim if you don't like it, and this is it for the trim. There's another aspect of the shader that I can't really demonstrate on this material right now, but I can show it to you in the shader graph. So for the trim, I added another functionality where it will only use the normal map and ignore the color map, and as a mask for that, it's using the blue vertex color of the mesh. So if I were to quickly modify this mesh, and paint a blue color on it, or black in the blue channel, you can see how the color on the trim disappears and only the normal map is left. So I've been using this mainly for the belt on this character, but really you can use it in any variety you think might be useful. I can think of loads of applications for that. Okay. Finally, there's one last function in the shader, which is the skirt opacity. Really, this is just a general opacity slider for using another vertex color channel as a mask. The green channel. So basically, if you paint a part of your mesh green, it will become invisible if you set this up as a mask shader like I did. So to demonstrate that quickly in the level, again, I can paint black, this time in the green channel. And in my material instance, I have to reduce this to 0. And you can immediately see how parts of the mesh start to disappear. Alright, I hope this was informative and helpful, and if you have any other questions, feel free to visit the polycount thread. I will be answering as much as possible. Enjoy!